Hello, and welcome to another UK column interview. My name is Debbie Evans, and today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back Roger Meacock, our consultant veterinary surgeon. But before I bring Roger on screen, I just want to throw a few questions to our audience because, just a few decades ago, the UK was a very different place. We were self-sufficient, grow your own. That's what we did. Allotments were a necessity. They weren't a luxury. Today, we are reliant on imports of food, of meat, to feed our population. Today's convenience and speed has replaced our need to cultivate and grow our own food. And we go into a supermarket. How many of us really consider where that food has come from? Where did it originate from? Who has worked the land to produce that food for us? Are we in the UK in danger of losing farming? And I think there's a lot of debate to be had around farming. And does the term farm even mean an animal farm, as my generation may remember farms as? How are we becoming used to wind farms, solar farms, even vertical farms? Perhaps even we'll mention floating farms. But where does the future lie with farming? And there's nobody better than to tell us about farming than Roger. So, Roger, welcome back to UK Column. Please give us a brief introduction of yourself, where you are and what you do.
Hi, thanks, Debbie. Yeah, absolutely. I started off as a vet, qualified in the early 1990s, and actually went into a farm-only practice. So I sort of got into the farming side of the whole veterinary industry very early on, and actually ended up leaving that side of my veterinary interest, which was really my first love in veterinary medicine, was the farming side, and that was primarily because I switched to using alternative methods, which didn't really lend themselves very easily to farming situations, but also because I could see after the BSE situation, my gut feeling even back then was that the government was moving towards, severely restricting farming, and I felt that I needed to add other eggs in my basket. So I've kept an interest in the farming side of things because that's always been my main, big interest of mine in the veterinary side of things. So yeah, I'm pleased to be able to be here and have a chat through some of my concerns, and I'm sure some of those concerns will be mirrored by the farming community as well.
Would you say that farming's almost become demonized, and that it seems to me that farmers are getting a really bad deal at the moment? And when I was growing up, even though I was born in a city and I'm a city girl, although I live in Cornwall now, I remember there being many more farms than there are now. And the small farms, I mean, have you noticed a difference through your career? Have you seen a difference in the size of farms or the diminishment of small farms?
Yeah, absolutely. There's I think when I first qualified, most of the farms that I went to, so certainly from the dairy side, probably were between 100 to 200 head of cows. And if you had a bigger one, it was, it's unusual. There might have been one that had 300. You might have had one that was 500. But that's very much the norm now. The squeeze has been put on the farmers, and it's meant that they've got to go to much bigger farms in order to spread those overheads and, reduce farm workers, rely more on mechanization and automation. And, I think I came across one farm and they had 2,000 dairy cows, and the production has gone up massively as well because the farmers are under so much pressure. So absolutely, it has totally changed in terms of how farming used to be done. And you're right, farmers do get demonized. You just think of some of the, something like Wallace and Gromit, where, the evil farmer is sort of extorting and taking advantage of the animals. And yet, every farmer that I ever got involved with loved their job. They loved their animals. They loved what they were doing, and they were very much aware of their welfare. They did the best that they possibly could. They got upset if, we went to a calving. Unfortunately, you can't save them all. They'd be upset if we lost a calf. And likewise cows, and they had their favourites. So, this whole idea that farmers are exploitative, it has been built up, and it doesn't make things easy for them. They do a job that is really 24/7. So, for example, if you had a dairy cow, they'd start milking very early in the morning. The cows they'd have to clear up after that, and then they do odd jobs around the farm, and then they do their evening milking and sort of check to make sure see if any cows are calving, and if they were, they'd go back later in the evening to see how they were doing, and if they still hadn't calved but they felt they were okay, they'd go back and check them again. So then maybe at midnight. So their day runs from 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, maybe even earlier, and through to midnight, and later if that cow then needs calving and needs a veterinary assistance, have to come out, perhaps do a cesarean or something. So, people talk about a 40-hour week and they want to reduce it down to 4 days a week or maybe 35 hours a week. So, well, farmers would laugh at that. They do that in 2 days. So, it is, it's a very different scenario from how they're portrayed to the public, and farmers work bloody hard. And they're taking on huge risks, because obviously if you've got a bigger herd, if there's an outbreak of foot and mouth or something, they're not losing 100. They might be losing 500 or more cows in that situation. So, there are big risks, and the supermarkets squeeze the profits for minimal reward, considering the hours and the investment they put into it all.
And it's because we had a chat about this obviously before, and it's little things that we don't think about, members of the public don't think about. You were talking about the hedgerows. Farmers will trim the hedgerows in order to keep the roads tidy, because it's keeping their animals in, so they tend to the land. But what I was surprised to hear, well, possibly not surprised to hear, with the cost of living and the desperation that farmers seem to find themselves in now, is that many farmers are having to make very difficult choices and rent out their land to maybe a phone mast provider, or someone that wants to put a solar farm on some of their land, or wind farms. Are you finding that this is happening a lot? Because obviously you don't have to tend to a load of solar panels, particularly not like you would a herd of cows. I mean, how much is this happening? How pressured are farmers into finding other means of income?
Yeah, certainly they're under pressure. They're being incentivized. I think there was a great interview that actually UK Column put out a few months ago with a farmer, and he was talking about how they're being paid to diversify and to not produce food. And they do look after the countryside. And they don't get paid for doing, well, they are getting paid a little bit now to do that sort of thing. And it's getting to the point where they're making more money from having a solar farm or a wind farm, or having an electromagnetic mast for telecoms or whatever on their property. And if they've got children who perhaps in past generations would take on the farm and go on to continue the farming, they're now looking at the work that their parents and the hours that they're having to put in to struggle to keep going, and they're deciding that they actually don't want to go into farming, or certainly don't want to do it in that way. So, farmers who've had generations on the land are suddenly finding that they've got nobody to take it forward, and if they can make more money or as much money by having solar farms or other sort of diversifications that they're being paid and encouraged to do. And actually, I think if they don't do a certain amount of it, they almost get penalized. So the incentives and the pressure on farmers is it comes from a lot of different directions. And I know a lot of again, there's this idea that farmers are huge, wealthy landowners, and I'm not saying that those sort of farmers and those landowners don't exist. Of course they do, but they're very much in the minority. And certainly the tenant farmers, they don't own their land. They've got to pay rent to be on their farms, and they're under pressure. And the hill farmers in Wales, and they're under huge pressure and have very, very little income really spare. So the public really don't have a very true picture of the hardship that many of them are undergoing.
And of course, not only are they undergoing all that hardship, but we seem to be being driven at an accelerated pace into eating a plant-based diet. We are seeing more and more vegan products. And, again, you got me thinking big time, because you highlighted that I'll let you explain. But basically, my question would be by eating a vegan diet, are we protecting animals?
Yeah, it's a good point, Debbie. Ultimately, there is no such thing as food production where animals don't unfortunately get killed. If you've got an arable farmer who's got crops, they've got to got to spray with pesticides, and then they've got to keep sort of the wild deer population, which has really got out of control, and sort of wild grazers from damaging the crops and eating the crops. And also once they've been cut and they're in storage, they've got to keep the vermin, the rats and the mice from trying to steal the grains and everything else. And like it or not, those animals end up, having to be killed to protect the crop and protect the food, because you don't want that sort of infection. You don't want rat and mouse urine or all the grains and everything. It's for disease point of view. So there is no such thing as animal free farming. It just doesn't exist. But certainly there is an agenda to push the veganism, push the plant-based diet, really based on very biased nutrition research, and it's just not the way we're supposed to be. And it's the farmers are under pressure if they aren't producing sufficient quantities of food, then they won't have the income. You can't downsize a farm to a point where it's underproductive and it doesn't support itself. That just isn't going to happen. Ultimately, the farmers have got to make a living from it. And if we all get pushed into plant-based foods and franken food and insects and all the rest of it that we seem to be being pushed down, then the animals aren't going to live. The farmers can't afford to just keep animals in the fields to look nice for someone who wants to drive down the road. Not that we'd be allowed to do those from 15-minute cities either. But there are huge knock-ons. We spoke before about our pet carnivores, cats and dogs. Farmers aren't going to be paid to keep cattle for our pet carnivores either. So there are big implications for our food chain, and there's a hell of a lot of politics involved on all sides, unfortunately, as usual.
See, this is really interesting for me because, as many of our regular viewers will have seen your 2 previous interviews, but if you haven't, the links will appear in the article beneath this interview. But in one of our last interviews, Roger, we were talking about raw feeding dogs and cats, and what animals were designed to eat meat and what animals aren't designed to eat meat. And it's very interesting to hear you say that, dogs and cats, that they've got the equipment on board, if you like, to be able to deal with eating raw. A cat will catch a bird, a dog maybe catch a rabbit. They're designed to eat like that in the wild. How are we designed? Are we designed to eat a plant-based diet, which is and insects? I mean, because as a vet, you know the anatomy and physiology of different animals, and you've been telling me about the differences in animals and how they can adapt to different diets or not adapt to a different diet. But what can we cope with? Can we survive on a plant-based diet, really, or are we carnivores?
Yeah, it's a good question, Debbie. Obviously, I'm a vet, and I will say I'm not qualified to give human nutrition advice. But on the other hand, if people are interested, I actually myself have a full carnivore diet, and I've been eating that way now for about 4 or 5 months. And I haven't taken that decision lightly, and I've done a lot of research into it. Um, and there's a doctor called Dr. Chaffee who's got a great YouTube channel, and he goes into the science of it in depth. He's been a carnivore, I think, for probably about 8 or 9 years, and he's we are an alpha predator. There is no other alpha predator on the planet that isn't a meat eater. And whilst, as I said, with the cats and dogs, whilst we can eat other foods, what we need to be at our best and what we need, what we can survive on, aren't necessarily the same. So yeah, we don't have a fermentation area in our digestive tract, the same as ruminants. They obviously have a rumen, so they've got their compound stomach, which is really a big fermentation vat for plant material, and the bacteria in there release all the nutrients from the plant material, and that gets absorbed by the cows and the ruminants. And then if you look at horses, they've got a very large colon. So that's the hind gut. And the fermentation area for horses is the hind gut. So they have these large fermentation vats for plant material that people just don't have. Our appendix is vestigial. It's often removed, although it's now been recognized to have more of an immune function. So I would, and many doctors who are carnivores and promote it for human health will say that we are primarily carnivorous, and our stomach acid is as equivalent to the major carnivores, and we are designed primarily to eat meat, although I will say here and now I do cook it.
Roger, that really takes me back to square one, if you like, because I'd never, people just don't maybe think about these things. But as you rightly pointed out, farming really only replaced hunting, because we would go out and hunt for our food. And then all of a sudden, farmers were there to provide our food for us. And then you told me, and of course I knew this, but I hadn't given it much thought. But if you go into the supermarket, the farmer's produce is tracked. So they're under huge pressure as well, because literally if someone gets ill or there's something wrong with that meat, then, or that food, then it can be tracked back to that particular farmer. So I'm presuming that they may get penalties there as well, or feel that they're under constant surveillance. So I can't imagine the stress and the pressure that they must be under. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that traceability has been brought in partly, obviously, to monitor in disease situations, but also, as you say, to track back on the food quality as well. And farmers are under huge pressure to produce food within certain parameters. So, for example, pigs that are slaughtered for meat, they're supposed to have a certain thickness of back fat on them, and if it's outside those parameters, then they get penalised. They don't get the full price for what they've produced. And then back in COVID, when there's all the lockdowns, the farmers were absolutely unable. It wasn't their fault. They were forbidden to send the pigs to slaughter, and yet when they did, they all got penalised because the pigs had obviously grown beyond the farmers couldn't not feed them. So they had to carry on feeding them. They kept on growing, and if they came outside those parameters that they were supposed to be delivered within, then the farmers got penalised for it, which is completely wrong morally, and likewise for the broilers, the meat chickens, that they are under contract to produce chickens that are finished at around 2.2 kilos, and at various other weight points that you see on the shelf in the supermarket. And if the chickens are underweight or overweight, then they will be penalised for it. So, but it also penalises farming, because if farmers come across techniques that could actually improve the efficiency of farming and make a change, then it's very difficult, because they've got their slot in order where they normally send all their chickens off, for example, to slaughter at 2.2 kilos. So if they do something that's makes it more efficient, then either the birds are going to be heavier by that date, or else there isn't a slot in the slaughterhouse window to bring the date forward. So it hinders the advancement of some of the things that could be done as well. So the supermarkets are absolutely totally in control about how everything's produced, and if they want to offer something on special offer, then very often that deduction is passed on to the farmers as well. So they control everything.
It really does sound as though it's the same story as these huge companies literally dominating absolutely everything. I want to address another elephant in the room, and again, I was surprised when you revealed to me the amount of pharmaceutical. Because let's face it, this interview is called Big Pharma, as in pharmaceuticals, small pharma, as in farming. But I was surprised to know really that pharmaceuticals don't actually figure too much, do they? Not as much as I believe that they did, and certainly not as much as pharmaceuticals figure in human health. It doesn't really figure as much, does it, in the farming community? Can you explain to us why that is?
Sure, yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, pharmaceuticals are an overhead for the farms. There is no NHS for farming. Everything that they do has got to be paid for, and that includes the vet's time, the visit, and any pharmaceuticals, anything that's dispensed or prescribed for those animals. So, farmers ideally want to produce their farms as healthy as possible, with as fewer vet visits as possible, using as fewer pharmaceuticals as possible. I think people get the wrong idea, because in the United States, they tend to use a lot more hormone use in their producing of their meat, and also there's a drug called BST that gets used for increasing milk production, and we banned it. It didn't come into the UK. So farmers get accused of using drugs when actually they don't, and anything that they do use has got to have a proper withdrawal time on it. So if for example an antibiotic is given to a cow with mastitis, which is an inflammation of the udder which can make the milk not right, then there is a withdrawal time according to how long the antibiotic stays in the system, so that it clears and there's no antibiotic passed on in the milk. So there are certain drug withdrawals for certain products when they're used within license, and if other drugs, for example, there was an antibiotic that wasn't licensed for cattle but actually turned out to have the sensitivity that was right for the microorganism, the bacteria that was causing the mastitis, it could be used in the cows, because obviously they need to be healthy, but there'd be a certain set milk withdrawal time to ensure that drug is actually, that antibiotic is withdrawn, so that it doesn't go into the food chain. So the farmers don't get paid for that milk that gets discarded when it's during withdrawal time. They only get paid for the milk that they send off and that gets collected by the tanker. So that they don't want to use drugs as if they can help it. And certainly, the veterinary industry, we've always been blamed a lot for the whole antimicrobial resistance, and I think that's a very unfair label. And I think, so there's been a lot of pressure on the veterinary industry to reduce the use of antibiotics because of the worry over antimicrobial resistance in the human side. And the whole veterinary industry as a whole is very, very conscious of that responsibility to maximize what we've got for antibiotics, because however you want to view your health, and whatever method you want to use to keep health, there may well be a time when you get an infection where the only option is an antibiotic, and if they're not available, that's pretty serious.
Actually, Roger, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, we know that certainly in the NHS, doctors are given incentives by pharmaceutical companies, and hence we get specific drugs rolled out at specific times, depending on what the incentives are. With vets, are vets not under the same pressure from pharmaceutical companies to roll out their drugs? Or is it because vets have got more ways of generating income from perhaps promoting food, kibble foods, and animal accessories, etc.? Is there because there's a bigger market, they've got more scope? Or are they not under as much pressure from the pharmaceutical companies as doctors seem to be?
I think the vets are under pressure. There's a lot of input from the pharmaceutical industry, certainly in terms of the training, and the drug reps will go round to the vet practices the same as they go round to the doctor's surgeries, and they'll be promoting their latest, pharmaceutical for whatever condition, and all the rest of it. So, they are under pressure from that point of view, and obviously the way medicine is taught, and across the human and animals fronts, there is a huge reliance on the pharmaceutical industry, but there are farmers who use homeopathy. There's a homeopathy at Welly level group, where the farmers are taught to use homeopathy instead, and those farmers who use it obviously getting good results. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to stay in business. But it's rubbished by the mainstream veterinary profession. And obviously it's under a lot of pressure from from the pharmaceutical industry as well. So there are other options, but it requires spending time to do the training and understanding to and then that big step of faith to use it when for years they've been told it doesn't work, and pharmaceuticals are the only way forward. So that's there's a lot of pressure not to go down another route. A lot of it from fear,
and also not just fear, I think, but I want to just touch on the effects of DEFRA and the powers that the Departments of Environment and Rural Affairs has. I mean, I don't know an awful lot about how DEFRA works, but how do you find working with DEFRA, and how do you find farmers working with DEFRA? And could they, for example, do what has been done to us, which is, well, basically there's a pandemic and we need to vaccinate all animals? Do DEFRA have the power to do that?
Yeah, I mean, DEFRA certainly have power, and you can understand to a certain degree why. All farmers have got to have a registered holding number, so all the farms are effectively registered, and all the animals on the farms have to be, tagged, so that they can be recorded, and obviously part of that is the traceability with that we've already spoken about the supermarkets, but also there's a disease traceability as well, because if animals pass through an animal market and then there's an outbreak somewhere on a farm that's received some animals that just come into the herd, then, or the flock, then they need to know where they've come from, and that just to trace back, especially if it's a notifiable disease. So DEFRA certainly has a certain degree of power in that, and I can understand why they might need it in certain circumstances. you're quite right, though, that if um, let's go back a bit. The World Health Organization has got this policy which they call One Health, which is sort of a parallel between human and animal health. And there have been a few outputting, shall we say, in not too recent or in recent months, where they've blamed human disease as an origin from animal disease. So they're basically saying that all human disease comes from animals, which is completely wrong. But there is this pressure, and potentially, if a pandemic was considered to be a zoonosis, so that it could pass between animals and humans and vice versa, then the World Health Organization, under the basis of the international health regulations and the pandemic treaty that it has in the pipeline, could potentially mandate actions to be taken with regard to livestock and animals in a country. And if that was passed into law, then DEFRA or whoever would be mandated to follow those laws and to enforce whatever edicts that come down from the World Health Organization. So, on one level, they have power within the UK, DEFRA, but obviously, if these edicts came down from outside, from the World Health Organization, if the UK government haven't put in their objections and we're automatically signed up to these treaties, then DEFRA could find themselves, whether they like it or not, having to mandate and enforce whatever laws have been passed, and that could include a mass cull slaughter, like happened with the foot and mouth disease that happened in the early 2000s.
I wanted to ask you actually about that because we've heard so much. I mean, in this country, in the UK, we've seen huge disasters with BSE, foot and mouth. We've recently had avian flu. I mean, it was only less than a year ago that every single bird had to be kept indoors, even people that had a couple of chickens in their back gardens. What kind of effects, looking back, Roger? I mean, we, the public, saw what was on the news, but hey, we all know how to take the news these days. But what effects did you see all of those disasters having upon farming in Britain?
Certainly, with the BSE had an effect. There were certain cohorts of cattle which had certain products of food and certain batches that turned out to be more at risk than others. So, at least although it was a notifiable disease, there was no horizontal transmission between cows. It could only came through the feed, so that there was no risk for it to being passed on to other cows within a herd, and individual cows could be, culled on the basis once they started showing symptoms. So the BSE, although it had an effect on the national herd and to certain farmers who had relied heavily on certain batches of feed within their herds, they lost quite a lot of cows, but they did get individually compensated for it. When it came to the foot and mouth, it was very much, if it was found on the farm, then all the cows were slaughtered, even if there was only necessary symptoms were only showing in a few individuals, because you couldn't assume that there weren't other cows within the herd incubating it. So the modelling was done by Professor Ferguson again. His models have been heavily criticised in the aftermath of that, and I think within the veterinary profession, they would say that the number of cows killed was OTT, but it was devastating to those farmers. Obviously, they'd spent years breeding and checking to make sure to maximise their herd, and they knew those animals from birth, and they were obviously massively, hugely upset and traumatized by seeing their herd being slaughtered and burnt as they were, as we saw the funeral pyres, if you like, on the field. So that was highly traumatic for farmers, and a lot of them took that opportunity, I think, to get out of farming as well, because it was so traumatic for them. And certainly, obviously, more recently with the avian flu, the problem is the wild bird life population can also be a reservoir. So it's you're trying to stop the spread of something that birds can in the wild can fly around and potentially spread to birds that are wandering around outside for free range. So that it's a problem. I think my take on it is if the animals were under less pressure, they would have a stronger immune system. But the animals are under pressure because the government have demanded the food production after the Second World War. A lot of it started for farmers to produce. So farmers are caught between a rock and a hard place where, society has demanded they have high production and put the pressure on to do so and maximize it with the supermarkets squeezing on the prices. Yet at the same time, they would love to be able to run a much more extensive system, but they're under financial pressures to be productive. So they're caught between a bit of a rock and a hard place. Although having said that, there are farmers who are starting to go back into more regenerative farming, and those are the sorts of farmers that we should be supporting and encouraging, and going back to some of the old ways of mixed farming and crop cycling and field rotation, and getting away from all this monoculture, which obviously depletes the soil and has done for decades. This was recognised in the United States in the 1930s, where I think there was a statement that said, "Never has the nation been so well fed but so undernourished," because actually the food didn't have the nutrients that it should necessarily have. It looked green, it looked big, it looked great, but actually in terms of the nutrient value, they weren't necessarily there as well. So it's a very complex issue, and there's pressures from all sides. And even, to be fair to the supermarkets, the government have put pressure on the supermarkets to keep the food prices relatively low too, because, when we're getting higher fuel costs, as we did, last year especially, and people under pressure, and obviously with inflation and interest rates and all the rest of it, the government is trying to keep themselves popular, and they're recognizing that people are under pressure financially, so they are using their influence to try and keep food prices down as well. And if British farmers stand fast and say, okay, we can't produce this food for unless you're going to pay us this price, and supermarkets will turn around and go, fine, we'll buy it in from abroad. Obviously, and we see a lot of evidence of that on the supermarket shelves already.
Yeah, so I'm listening to this and I'm thinking to myself, right, so many small farms have disappeared, which means their big farms are more difficult to get to. And farmers are being squeezed by the supermarkets. So a solution to this, obviously, would be for farmers to sell direct to us, the public. But of course, if the farms are now not easily accessible and we're not going to be able to travel very far, then that in itself creates yet another problem. How can we persuade or ask farmers to consider selling to us direct? I mean, would they trust the public to buy direct from them? And do you think it's fair to ask them even to sell direct, or perhaps you think that's maybe the only way forward?
Certainly there are options. Some farms will have their own farm shops where people can go, and the produce will come straight from the fields on there, and maybe that farm shop will have other farmers in the locality who will supply. So maybe an arable farm will have the farm shop, but they'll buy meat in from a local farmer that they know down the road who's a friend, and sell their meat as well. So there are farm shops which I would encourage people to go to. There are farmers markets. Some of the towns will have farmers markets at various times a week. maybe two or three times during the week. And different farms in a local area will have them at different times. So, and some farmers will be able to sell their produce online. So, you can get, buy in bulk effectively, or rather than just buy one or two meals at a time, and do it that way. So there are ways of accessing, healthy, happy produce. And I would encourage people to support those outlets where they can. And very often, although the meat might be a little bit more expensive, very often the veg is cheaper. The supermarkets tend to have loss leaders in certain product ranges. So, if people shop around, they can probably find a way of not making a huge difference to what they're having to spend on food, but actually increasing the quality of what they're getting, because the middle people are being cut out. And ultimately, supply and demand usually drives everything. So, I would encourage farmers, to even get together in terms of finding groups. And there are food cooperations springing up around the country as well, for people who want to source direct and locally. So I would encourage farmers to reach out and find out who's doing what in certain areas, and encourage them to try and find other ways of getting their food direct, so that they get a fair price that gives them a bit of financial freedom to be a bit more extensive in how they do it. And have a look into the regenerative farming. It is certainly developing, and they can do that and maintain their incomes, or potentially improve it if they found the right way of getting their produce to market that is more direct.
I think it's a great idea. And I think, often if you do go to a farm shop or you go direct to the farmer, yes, we are being squeezed. The cost of living is getting to everybody. But often you may just pay that little bit extra, but the nutrition that you get back is phenomenal compared to something that you could pick up at a supermarket, for example. And of course, you're not going to have to give a local farm shop, I would presume, your biometric data, which that's the way we look as though we're going with supermarkets at the moment. Are you ever going to be able to get into a supermarket, should you want to, unless you give your biometric data? And we're already seeing hearing of many reports where supermarket car parks are being filled with NHS scanners and breath testers and future health examinations. So I don't know if anybody's actually going to want to go to a supermarket anytime soon. But, looking at all of these hurdles that farmers are having they're literally everywhere, hurdles everywhere. And on top of that, we've got this whole rewilding project going on. So we can see land grabs in Cornwall here, for example. I know that there are farmers that have literally lost their land to natural England for rewilding and for preservation. So what's the deal, Roger, with tenant farmers? Do we still have tenant farmers? Are they finding that their land is being taken back by authorities? Do we have any tenant farmers left?
Yeah, I think we do. That there are tenant farmers, absolutely, but and hopefully they've got good long contracts that stop those sorts of grabs. But certainly, some of the farmers or livestock holders who perhaps got commoners' rights on some of our national parks, some of those are being found that those are being withdrawn and restricted, and the numbers pulled back. So yeah, they are under pressure from that point of view, and one of the reasons we were able to hold out during the Second World War was because we were so, self-sufficient. I mean, as you know, we spoke the very first time. I did a letter of concern about the potential use of mRNA jabs in food animals, and my concern is, okay, even if we're successful in stopping those jabs being used in the UK, if they are being used in other countries and we aren't self-sufficient in our food, if that food is only being moved around from countries where they are using mRNA jabs on their animals, then we are in that situation where we are forced, if we want to eat meat, to source it from a country where those jabs are being used, and we have no idea then what the safety of that food is. So it is important that we support our farmers and buy British as much as you possibly can, because I would say, our welfare here is, on the whole, absolutely much better than any other country around. And there's always going to be the odd bad apple in a barrel. But on the other hand, if the animals aren't being well looked after, they aren't going to survive, they aren't going to thrive, and the farmers aren't going to survive very well either. So I would argue that actually British farming is the pinnacle of in many ways of the farming worldwide, and the welfare here is as good as we can make it. Obviously, we always try to improve it, but again, it's got to be done within financial constraints. And if we want to keep that animal welfare high and support our farmers, and also then have much of a more to greater degree of control over the food quality and how it's produced, then we can do that best by controlling what goes on in our own country. So I would say, buy British.
I'm really reassured to hear this. I'm really reassured because animal welfare it's always been top of my radar, as I'm sure many of our viewers it will be on top of their radars too. And looking after animals, I mean, I adore animals. I think, we are a country, or we're meant to be a country and a nation of animal lovers. But I want to just ask you, because those viewers that may not realize that Roger is actually also an expert in EMF, electromagnetic frequencies. And I just want to ask you, Roger, with all of these masts going up all over the place, what effects could that have on our animals? Because essentially that is the welfare of our animals. I mean, I can't imagine what it must feel like for animals to be in a field literally next to a phone mast. What impact does that have?
Yeah, Debbie, absolutely. You drive around and you see masts very much, and they're often very close to the farm buildings as well. They're because they've probably come in got to be powered, so they keep the mast fairly close to the buildings so that all the cabling doesn't have to travel huge distances across fields away from where maybe the animals are being housed. So there are absolutely lots of studies to show that animals are adversely affected by the signals from the masts and the telecoms. So and birds are very much actually more susceptible to EMFs than we are, than other mammals, because the feather actually channels the signal deeper into the body. It creates what's called a piezoelectric effect, so that the birds are very much more harmed by and distressed by the EMFs than say cattle or sheep. But even when it comes to to sort of pigs or cattle, the signals from the mast are causing defects, birth defects, DNA damage, increased disease, and obviously we know it affects human fertility, so it will affect their fertility as well. So that is important for farming production. And actually, there's been research done in Russia, who are light years ahead of us in terms of understanding frequency and microwaves, especially on the body. And they will say that even if water or food is exposed to these microwave frequencies, the harm from those frequencies will be carried into the body via the water and via the food. So the idea that millimeter waves don't affect us very much because they don't penetrate very far into the body is, again, completely wrong, because there are other ways that the EMFs, even of a very short wavelength, can still penetrate deeper into the body than we're being let on to believe.
I mean, it's a whole new subject, isn't it, of its own? Just that. So maybe we'll have to do an EMF special as well, Roger, because your knowledge on that is huge. And another area that, again, I hadn't thought of until you said to me, this whole agenda moving forward. Are we ever going to? Is British farming going to survive? It's not just the farmer, is it? It's the equipment, because as you reminded me, tractors operate on diesel, and they get stuck in mud. So how does an electric tractor work, or doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, Debbie. Certainly in the winter, you see fields where perhaps there's especially something like an outdoor pig unit, and you'll see where the tracks around all the outside pens where the pigs are kept, and you'll see how deep the mud is and how slushy it is, and all the mud that gets kicked onto the road by the farmers coming back onto the road to go between the different fields if they've got to use the roads to do that. So you can imagine and the power the tractors have. They need that power for doing the jobs that they do. So in order to generate that amount of power electrically would require massive batteries. There is no way that a field that's been freshly ploughed in relatively soft ground, or especially sort of something that's very clayey ground, in the wet, the mass, the weight of the tractors and would just sink. They'd end up being bogged down in fields. They would only really be viable in the middle of the summer when the ground is baked hard. There's no viability there, as pretty much there's no viability for our cars long term either.
Also, I was going to ask you about the viability of your own profession of vets, because if we're seeing smaller farms disappearing, and larger farms but more spaced out. I mean, traditionally, I remember the vet being down the road, the vet being a mile away. How does the farming community per se impact on your profession specifically?
Yes, Debbie, it's had a massive impact. When I first qualified, the practice that I worked at, the farms were. We had a lot of farms in a relatively small area, and there was 4 of us that covered that area. But partly to do with specialisation within the profession, and partly to do with small farms, deciding to get out of farming, and big farms getting bigger, though they then become that much more spaced apart. And if a practice hasn't, a lot of, you think back to James Herriot days, virtually every practice was a mixed practice. So they all did all species. And because the farms now have become very much more sparsely popular, they're spread out so much more. If a practice has only got 1 or 2 or 5 farms left in its normal territory, they will say it's not viable to keep servicing those farms. So I remember my old boss, we had a conversation many years after I'd moved on from there. We kept in contact because we were good friends, and he said to me, we picked up another farm the other day, but it's 150 miles away, and the practice who told us and said, we've gone out of farming, so we've recommended to you. It's like, well, thanks, but what for? I've got to now cover a much larger area, and for a vet to drive 150 miles to get to a farm, it's not particularly viable in an emergency situation. It's not very good for the animal. It's certainly not good for the vets to be spending so much more time driving between the farms instead of actually working and doing what they need to do on the farms, and helping out. So, the farming side of the profession has become spread out, covering huge patches, and not necessarily as accessible as they would like to be. to those farmers as well. And although the veterinary profession has tried to move, certainly on the farming side, to be more preventative than reactive, because then you can timetable preventative visits and try and make sure things are as good as possible and emergencies are as minimized as possible, so that those long drives in in that emergency situation are minimized to, as much as possible. You'll never fully stop them. So yeah, it is a problem. It is a problem for the veterinary profession, and I would likewise say that the veterinary profession needs to be aware that if they continue to support the sort of policies which look like they are pushing farmers to move out of animal farming, then where is the farm animal vet profession going to be? There isn't going to be a job for us potentially either. So, keeping quiet may be the easy option. I think I read a quote the other day, and it said, "If you sleep in a democracy, you'll wake up in a dictatorship." So it's very much the time now where we need to be aware of the threats and have conversations with the farmers, with the everybody involved, to see what is the long term plans for this. What is the viability, and what are the implications of some of the diversity pressures which are being put on farmers to help to maintain our food, our food supplies for ourselves. I know we're potentially heading into another war situation in the Middle East. We don't know how that's going to knock on and go into other areas. Might affect food transport to the UK. So, we are vulnerable, not necessarily because things are happening on our border, but if something is happening much further away, but it interferes with the whole food transport chain. And also, all this pressure for reducing flying around the world. If we're not producing the food ourselves, it can only come in from around the world. So, if they're going to start putting big premiums on food that's been traveled because of carbon footprints and all the rest of it, whether that's right or wrong is irrelevant to the fact that the bill will be passed on to us, or else the food won't be available. So these are important conversations that need to be had, because the implications are far-reaching.
I think you're absolutely right. I think they are very important conversations to be had. And I hope that maybe some of our audience now that are listening, that if you're in the farming profession and you do want to help us work out a way that we can support you in order to, well, I mean, I'm listening to you, Roger, and I think I'm worried certainly about the future of farming in the UK, and I think everybody watching this should also be concerned. But if you are out there and you are a farmer, clearly it's not easy out there. We would love to hear from you, and perhaps we can have a discussion, a round table discussion of how to move forward and what is the best way for the public to support farming. And clearly, I think that if you're in a position and you're watching now and you're in a rural area, you're fortunate enough to know where there is going to be a local farmers market or there is a farm close by, then please think about supporting your local farmer, because clearly, we're not going to have any farms very soon. And that was going to be really, as I wind up, Roger, was going to be my final question to you. Through the eyes of a vet, you're right there watching it all, you're in the thick of it. What do you think, or what do you see the future of Britain's farming as being?
Well, I mean, I'm hopeful. I tried to keep positive, and I want farming to carry on, because, I think, our welfare is very good, and it's important that British farmers do carry on and keep pushing those boundaries and get back to the more regenerative farming again. And so I would encourage farmers to look to being regenerative, being less dependent on agrochem, as well as pharma, finding other ways to do things, taking the pressure off off their animals so that they will, be more resilient as well. And as you say, encourage people who, to buy locally as much as possible. Our local food is always our best food. To try and look at setting up cooperatives. There are people who are already doing it. Just search for them online. I'm sure they'll be relatively easily found, and will be happy to spread their concepts of how they run their food cooperative, so that others can do likewise in their own areas. And encourage the farmers and those who are interested in maximising their food quality and keeping things local and supporting our countryside, which is part of it as well. Encourage those groups to get together and work it out.
And Roger, before I throw to you for the last word, because really we've only scraped the tip of the iceberg, haven't we? Because farming is such a huge subject, and I'm sure there's plenty of our audience going, oh, but we need to know this, or could you ask that? And there's going to be some questions, and I know there already are some questions which I've been throwing your way too. So how do people get in contact with you? Where do they find you?
Yeah, I'm fairly easily findable on the net. Just put my name in and you'll come up with my websites. I've got naturalhealingsolutions.co.uk, which is my sort of normal veterinary practice website that explains all the alternative things that I do. But yeah, I mean, just find me, contact me. I'm fairly approachable. I don't bite, and yeah, happy to hear from people. I'm trying to also get the word out internationally. So if there are international farmers and vets who are watching this, who haven't heard about the open letter of concern about the mRNA jabs in animals, then please get in contact with me, because I do see this as a worldwide problem, because food is being moved worldwide, and we need to all be singing off the same song sheet, and people need to get up to speed with what the potential dangers are. And hopefully, we can move forward and keep everything going as we want it to be in the future.
I completely agree with you. And, my last word for today is going to be to people out there: buy local. Whichever country you're in, we're talking today about the United Kingdom. So I would say to people in the UK, buy British, buy local, support your local farmer. It might take you a little bit longer to get to the farm than the supermarket, but the benefits are absolutely huge. And whatever country you're living in, grow your own, buy local, and support your local producers, not the globalists, because they really don't have your best interests at heart. And on that note, Roger, I'm sure we're going to be meeting again very soon, and I'm incredibly grateful to you. And if there are any other vets that are watching as well who would like to get in contact with Roger, or who would like to contribute to the discussion, have something to add, we're always up for a discussion. So please do get in touch. So on that note, Roger, thank you so much. And over to you for the last word.
Thanks, Debbie. I mean, as we said, sort of fairly close to the beginning, farmers are often demonized unjustly for being cruel and all the rest of it. And, I just want to get that message across that farmers care deeply for their animals. They wouldn't do the job 24/7, 365 unless they actually had that empathy and their love for their animals in a way that perhaps people who are pet owners don't necessarily understand, because the food is, the animals are going for slaughter. But that is providing a service to us. It is part of our evolutionary diet that we eat meat, and we need to recognize that. And although slaughterhouses don't sound like the nicest places on earth, and they're not, but on the other hand, we push the welfare there as much as we possibly can, and we need to bear in mind that the options, as you said, was in the past we'd go out and hunt, and if someone wasn't a very good shot, that animal could be injured, may not necessarily be caught straight away. So although the whole idea of slaughterhouses doesn't sound very nice, it's actually a much faster, cleaner, quicker way than happens in nature. And nature is cruel. You watch some of these programs where carnivores are hunting, and they animals get chased. They're in fear while they're being chased. Obviously, they then get jumped on by however many animals. Don't necessarily die straight away. And you look at the Komodo dragons, they bite the ankle of a wildebeest and or a buffalo and follow it around for 3 days until sepsis sets in, and then the beast dies and they eat it. So, what we do with our own food production is we've got to keep it in context with what it's replaced. And, not saying it's perfect by any means, but we push to do the best that we can for the animals. And those of us who are involved in the veterinary side of looking after the animals are very aware of our responsibility to the public in terms of the food quality, the animal quality, and quite frankly, with the state of farming at the moment, if the animals weren't happy, they wouldn't necessarily be as productive as they are. So, everybody's doing their best. Everybody's doing their best, and we know that it's not perfect, but we're pushing as much as we can in that direction.